In the middle of the 1500s, the Medici family of Florence reached a new height. In 1537, Cosimo de' Medici became the second Duke of Florence. Later, he would take on the even more impressive title of Grand Duke of Tuscany. His rise came shortly after the death of his cousin, Pope Clement VII. Clement had followed Pope Leo X, another Medici who led the Catholic Church from 1513 to 1521, just a few years before Cosimo took power. Yet another Medici, Catherine, had married the future King of France, Henry. When Henry became king in 1547, Catherine became Queen of France. 3 of her sons would go on to rule France. Another Medici woman became the mother of the Bourbon dynasty, which ruled France for much of the 1600s and 1700s. Dukes, popes, queens, and kings, this was the world of the Medici in the 16th century. Yet strangely, the family's greatest influence may have come earlier. In the 1400s, when they helped spark the Renaissance in Florence. Few families in history have shaped the world like the Medici. Their story begins in the countryside near Florence, in a small farming village called Cafaggiolo, in Tuscany, about 20 kilometers north of the city. The name Medici comes from the Italian word for doctor, medico, suggesting that someone in their past may have been a healer. But no clear record of this person exists, and medical practice back then was more folk tradition than science. The family began as poor peasants, but gradually improved their position. By the early 1300s, they had enough money to begin lending at interest, a sign of growing prosperity. This happened just as Florence was becoming Tuscany's leading trade and finance center, overtaking Pisa and Siena. The Medici soon became one of Florence's top banking families. Their rise happened during a period in European history that was both full of promise and full of pain. Between the 1000s and 1300s, known as the High Middle Ages, Europe experienced rapid change. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa became major trading hubs around the Mediterranean. Literacy grew, universities opened in cities like Bologna and Pisa, and great works of literature began to appear, such as Dante's Divine Comedy in the early 1300s. Artists like Giotto were transforming visual art, and early humanist scholars were traveling to monasteries to rediscover lost ancient texts. But Italy was also a violent place. The land was divided into competing states Florence, Milan, Venice, and the Papal States, and was plagued by war, rival armies, and mercenary leaders called condottieri. All this was worsened by disasters like the Great Famine of 1315 and the Black Death of the 1340s. The Medici rose to power in Florence during this mix of cultural growth and political chaos. We begin seeing the Medici in historical records in the early 1300s. By then, several family members had moved into Florence and entered banking. Banking was becoming more complex. Banks offered loans, managed money for merchants, and connected with partners in other cities. One early Medici, Averardo, was already doing well by the 1350s. But the family hadn't yet built the immense fortune they would later achieve. In Florence, wealth from banking often opened the door to politics. One Medici, Salvestro, became the gonfalonier, the top official in the city's government, similar to a mayor. He got caught up in a struggle between Florence's wealthy elite and the working poor in what became the Ciompi Revolt in 1378. By the end of the 1300s, the Medici, once peasants, now saw themselves as part of Florence's upper class. As Salvestro got involved in the city's political unrest, his cousin Giovanni di Medici, son of Averardo, came of age. Though Giovanni inherited only a small part of the family business, he proved to be a genius. He grew the banking operation and began to bring various branches of the family's money-lending business under one name, the Medici Bank. Throughout the late 1300s and early 1400s, Giovanni took advantage of the constant wars in Italy and the split within the Catholic Church to make money. He loaned money to governments, nobles, and even rival popes. By the time he died in 1429, the Medici Bank was one of the largest in Europe. Giovanni's son, Cosimo, would take it even further. Cosimo de' Medici, born in 1389, quickly became a key figure in the bank. In 1415, he attended the Council of Constance, which tried to end the papal schism between competing popes in Rome and France. The Medici supported one of those popes, John XXIII, who ultimately lost. Still, Cosimo's role showed how central he already was to the family's affairs. After Giovanni's death in 1429, Cosimo took over. Unlike other families who tried to become dukes or princes, Cosimo worked behind the scenes. He used his wealth to back allies and family members in Florence's Republic-style government. Through influence and quiet control, he effectively ruled the city without wearing a crown. Not everyone in Florence welcomed Medici dominance. Rival families like the Strozzi, Albizzi, and Pazzi formed coalitions to try and block Cosimo's growing influence. But Cosimo had other strengths. He wasn't just a banker or politician. He was a man of culture. Florence had already become a center of artistic and intellectual rebirth, the Renaissance. Writers like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio had laid the foundations. Artists like Lorenzo Ghiberti and Filippo Brunelleschi were transforming art and architecture. Giovanni de' Medici had supported them, and Cosimo continued that tradition. Cosimo hired talented artists and thinkers. Among them were Michelangelo, who designed the Medici's Grand Palace in Florence, and Donatello, who sculpted the famous bronze statue of David, the first freestanding nude since ancient times. Cosimo also funded scholars to find and copy ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts. One of these scholars, Niccolò Nicolai, even developed a new style of handwriting, what we now call italics. Though Cosimo was briefly exiled in 1433, he returned stronger than ever the following year. In 1439, he hosted a major church council in Florence to try and reunite the Catholic and Orthodox churches. The effort failed in the long term, but it elevated Cosimo's reputation and brought Greek scholars to Florence. Their teachings helped inspire a new wave of learning, including the creation of a Platonic academy supported by Cosimo. So how rich was Cosimo? His grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent later claimed that between 1434 and the early 1470s, the Medici spent 600,000 florins on arts, buildings, and education. That's more than $500 million in today's money just on culture. Cosimo expanded the bank across Europe, with branches in Lyon, Geneva, Bruges, and even London. Through these, the family entered the textile trade and financed wars. They also got involved in mining alum, used for dyeing fabric. Cosimo died in 1464, succeeded by his sickly son Piero, who ruled only until 1469. Piero's short reign wasn't successful. He mishandled loans and weakened the bank. Fortunately, his son Lorenzo, just 20 at the time, was ready to lead. Lorenzo de' Medici, later called Il Magnifico, was brilliant, charming, politically sharp, and a great patron of the arts. Lorenzo continued the family tradition of supporting artists and thinkers. Though young, he supported Sandro Botticelli, who painted The Birth of Venus and La Primavera. He also backed Leonardo da Vinci's teacher, Verrocchio, and helped the young Michelangelo get started in art. Lorenzo even let him live in the Medici palace. He also kept supporting humanist scholars like Marsilio Ficino, who carried on Cosimo's work in the Platonic Academy. All this happened in a city of only around 50,000 people, yet its cultural impact was immense. But Lorenzo's rule wasn't peaceful. In 1478, the Pazzi family and their allies, including Pope Sixtus IV, plotted to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during church. Giuliano was killed, but Lorenzo escaped. He crushed the plotters, killed their leaders, and reasserted control. Although the Pope excommunicated him, Lorenzo emerged even stronger. The Medici had now ruled Florence for nearly 100 years through strategy and influence. But future leaders were not always so capable. When Lorenzo died in 1492, his son Piero took over. But Piero faced trouble immediately. The bank was declining, and Italy was about to be rocked by foreign invasions. In 1494, the French King Charles VIII invaded Italy, aiming to take Naples. Piero tried to make peace by allowing French troops through Tuscany, but this angered the people of Florence. A radical friar, Girolamo Savonarola, stirred public rage, and Piero was driven out. The Medici went into exile. Florence became a republic again. Savonarola burned books, art, and vanities in the city square. He was executed in 1498. Florence was now led by Republican leaders like Machiavelli. The Medici were not gone for good. After the fall of Savonarola, Florence continued to be ruled by Republican officials like Piero Soderini, with Niccolò Machiavelli serving as a key diplomat. But political tides were changing again, and so were alliances across Europe. By the early 1500s, the Medici found new ways to regain their power. Giovanni de' Medici, the younger son of Lorenzo the Magnificent and brother of the ousted Piero, had become the head of the family during their exile. He was living in Rome, building strong ties with the church and with foreign rulers, especially Spain. In 1512, with support from Pope Julius II and the Spanish army, Giovanni led a move to take back Florence. At the time, there was no full-blown war. Instead, a political shift inside the city allowed the Medici to return peacefully. After nearly 2 decades in exile, the family was back in power. Giovanni wasn't interested in ruling Florence like his father or grandfather had. He had much bigger ambitions. He wanted to be pope. When Pope Julius II died in early 1513, Giovanni used his influence and alliances to win the papal election. He became Pope Leo X, the first Medici pope. In Florence, he left his brother Giuliano in charge, but Giuliano's rule didn't last long. He died in 1516. It was clear that Giuliano was never going to be the central figure of the family. That role would soon fall to Lorenzo de' Medici the Younger, son of the exiled Piero. Named after his famous grandfather, Lorenzo quickly gained political power. First, he became Duke of Urbino, a smaller but important territory. Then, by 1516, he had taken control of Florence as well. In 1513, just after Giovanni became Pope Leo X, Niccolò Machiavelli, now out of favor in Florence, dedicated the prince to Lorenzo the Younger. Despite its reputation today, the prince was not a guide for ruthless dictatorship. Machiavelli was actually urging Lorenzo to lead wisely and earn the people's trust. By this time, the Medici were no longer just trying to survive in Florence. Their long exile had forced them to form ties across Italy and Europe. Now they were international power brokers. Giovanni as Pope Leo X was one of the most powerful men in the world, but his papacy would have enormous consequences. To raise money for building projects like St. Peter's Basilica, Leo X greatly increased the sale of indulgences certificates that promised forgiveness of sins. When this practice spread into Germany, it sparked Martin Luther's protest and the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Luther's opposition caught fire quickly. By the time Pope Leo X died in 1521, large parts of Germany were on the edge of religious rebellion. His actions had set off a chain of events that would lead to more than a century of religious wars in Europe. Only 2 years after Leo's death, another Medici took the papal throne. This time it was Giulio de' Medici, son of Giuliano, who had been murdered in the Pazzi conspiracy back in 1478. Giulio had risen quietly through the church, thanks to his cousin Leo's help. In 1523, he became Pope Clement VII. Clement faced major crises during his time as pope. The Protestant Reformation was spreading fast. Sweden converted officially in 1527, and countries like England and Denmark were moving in that direction too. But Clement had bigger problems at home. The Italian wars were raging again, and in 1527, the unthinkable Happendrome was sacked by the troops of Charles V, the powerful King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. The city was looted and occupied for months. Plague swept through, and Clement was essentially a prisoner in his own capital. Clement also got caught up in the marital problems of King Henry VIII of England. Henry wanted the Pope's approval to divorce Catherine of Aragon, Charles V's aunt. But with Clement stuck under Spanish pressure, he couldn't grant the divorce. This drove Henry to break away from the Catholic Church, beginning England's shift to Protestantism. Even though Clement's time was full of crisis, he was still the head of the Medici family, and he made a dramatic move to change their position permanently. For generations, the Medici had controlled Florence while still keeping the appearance of a republic, but that changed during his papacy. In 1527, as Rome was falling into chaos, a rebellion broke out in Florence, trying once again to throw out the Medici. It took 3 years to crush this uprising. In 1530, with help from Charles V, Clement restored Medici power in Florence for good. But this time, the old republic was gone. He named Alessandro de' Medici, widely believed to be his own illegitimate son, as the first Duke of Florence in 1532. This was a turning point. Florence had become a hereditary monarchy ruled by the Medici, no longer a republic in name or form. Alessandro's rule didn't last long. In 1537, he was assassinated by a distant cousin. Replacement was Cosimo de' Medici the Younger, from a different branch of the family. Cosimo's father had been a respected military commander, and now young Cosimo would lead a new chapter in Medici rule. At just 17 years old, he quickly proved to be clever and ambitious. Over time, Cosimo would not only solidify his control over Florence, but also raise the family's status even higher, eventually changing his title from Duke of Florence to Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1569. But Pope Clement VII had one more plan in motion before his death in 1534. He arranged a marriage for his cousin, Catherine de' Medici, daughter of Lorenzo the Younger. In 1533, when she was just 14, she married Prince Henry, second son of King Francis, the first of France. 3 years later, Henry's older brother died, making Catherine the likely future queen. And in 1547, when Francis I died, Henry became King Henry II of France. Catherine was now queen consort. This was the beginning of another powerful chapter in Medici history. While Cosimo the Younger ruled Florence as a duke, Catherine would have several sons who would all go on to become kings of France. The Medici were now not just rulers of Florence and Tuscany, they were at the heart of European royal politics. By the mid-1500s, the Medici family had fully entered the world of royal power. In Florence, Cosimo the Younger ruled firmly as duke, and later Grand Duke of Tuscany. Meanwhile, in France, Catherine de' Medici held a powerful position as queen consort. Her influence only grew stronger after the sudden death of her husband, King Henry II, in 1559. He was killed during a jousting tournament held to celebrate a peace treaty between France and Spain. His death changed everything. Catherine's oldest son, Francis II, became king. But he was only 15 years old and in poor health. Catherine quickly stepped into the role of political leader, managing state affairs behind the scenes. When Francis died just a year later in 1560, another of her sons, Charles IX, took the throne. He was even younger, just 10 years old, and so Catherine officially became regent ruler on his behalf. This was a tense time in French history. The kingdom was tearing apart in a brutal conflict between Catholics and Protestants, known as the Wars of Religion. Catherine tried to balance the factions, but her efforts were often seen as cold and calculated. She arranged a major marriage between her Catholic daughter, Margaret, and the Protestant nobleman Henry of Navarre, later to become King Henry IV of France. The wedding was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it led to one of the bloodiest events in French history. Just days after the wedding, violence exploded in Paris. On the night of August 23, 1572, Catherine was deeply involved in a planned attack on the Protestant leaders who had come to the city for the marriage. What followed was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Thousands of Protestants were killed in the streets of Paris and in other cities across France. Catherine's name became forever linked to the massacre, and her role in it cast a long shadow over her legacy. Despite the horror of the massacre, Catherine remained a powerful figure in French politics for years. But tragedy continued to strike her family. 3 of her 4 sons who became kings died without heirs. Francis II died in 1560. Charles IX died in 1574, likely from tuberculosis. Another son, Francis, Duke of Anjou, died in 1584. Catherine's last surviving son, Henry III, was left as the only hope for continuing the royal Valois line. But Henry III's reign was unstable. He had no children, and political unrest continued to grow. In 1589, just 8 months after Catherine's own death, Henry III was assassinated by a radical Catholic monk who believed the king had been too lenient toward Protestants. With his death, the direct line of the Valois dynasty and the Medici connection through Catherine was broken. Surprisingly, the Medici family didn't disappear from French power just yet. Although Catherine's daughter Margaret and her husband Henry of Navarre had lived separately for years, he now became King Henry IV, the first monarch from the House of Bourbon. In 1599, he officially ended his marriage to Margaret and began looking for a new wife. The Medici re-entered the picture once again. In 1600, Henry IV married Marie de' Medici, daughter of Francesco I de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Marie came from a powerful line The Medici were still rulers in Florence and Tuscany, and her uncle Ferdinando was Grand Duke at the time. Ferdinando had supported Henry during France's civil wars and had helped convince him to convert to Catholicism. In return, Henry agreed to marry his niece. This new marriage gave the Medici family a fresh link to the French throne. Marie de Medici became queen consort of France, just like Catherine had decades earlier. Their marriage produced several children, including the future King Louis XIII, who would rule France starting in 1610 after Henry IV was assassinated. Through Marie, the Medici bloodline lived on in the Bourbon monarchy. In fact, her daughter Henrietta Maria later married Charles I of England, bringing Medici influence into British royalty too. The Medici reached even greater heights of international influence, but this would be their last grand chapter in European politics. The 1600s would mark the beginning of their slow decline. Florence and Tuscany remained under their control, but they began to lose their place at the center of European affairs. As political power shifted north to countries like France, England, and the Netherlands, Italy, the Medici were left behind. Still, Marie de Medici remained a major figure. After her husband's assassination in 1610, she served as regent for their young son, Louis XIII. Like Catherine before her, Marie held real power during her son's early years. She was active in French politics and court life, and she kept strong ties to her family in Florence. But the 17th century was different from the Medici's golden age. The bold, confident leadership of men like Cosimo de' Medici and Lorenzo the Magnificent had faded. Now, the Medici were holding on to their legacy, rather than building it. The Renaissance had moved north. The new cultural center of Europe was not Florence, but cities like Amsterdam and Paris. By now, the Medici in Florence were no longer daring bankers or radical thinkers. They were conservative rulers who focused more on titles and traditions than on shaping the future. They still ruled Tuscany, but their influence had shrunk to a local level. While their name carried weight, they were no longer shaping Europe the way they once had. Back in Florence, while Marie de' Medici was navigating the French royal court, the Medici family continued ruling Tuscany, though their power had become more local than continental. In 1621, Ferdinando II became Grand Duke of Tuscany. He would rule for nearly 50 years, one of the longest reigns in Medici history. Unlike his famous ancestors, Ferdinando wasn't involved in great wars or bold political moves. Instead, his reign stood out for one key reason: science. During Ferdinando's time, Europe was experiencing the scientific revolution. New ideas about the universe were challenging centuries of belief. One of the most important thinkers of this age was Galileo Galilei, who lived and worked in Tuscany. Galileo had made bold claims, such as the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun, something the Catholic Church strongly opposed. Ferdinando tried to support Galileo when the Church attacked his work. Though he couldn't stop the Church from silencing Galileo, he did visit him during his house arrest and remained a loyal friend. Later, in 1657, Ferdinando helped establish the Accademia del Cimento, or Academy of Experiment, in Florence. It was one of Europe's first scientific societies, founded before even the Royal Society in London. The Academy brought together scientists to carry out experiments and publish their findings. It was one of the few bright spots in a century when the Medici were mostly in decline. Despite these contributions, Ferdinando's reign also revealed how far the family had fallen. In the 1640s, Tuscany got involved in a small war over a city called Castro. The conflict drained the treasury. Florence, once home to the richest bank in Europe, was now facing financial struggles. The Medici's wealth was drying up. When Ferdinando died in 1670, he was succeeded by his son, Cosimo III. Cosimo ruled even longer than his father, an exhausting 53 years, but his reign marked the clear decline of the dynasty. Though he married Marguerite Louise of Orleans, a cousin of France's King Louis XIV, the marriage was a disaster. She eventually fled to a convent. They did have children, but these children would bring no renewal to the family line. Cosimo III was the opposite of his great namesake, Cosimo the Elder. He was deeply religious and highly conservative. Instead of encouraging art and new ideas, he focused on enforcing strict moral laws in Florence. He banned festivals, cracked down on what he saw as immoral behavior, and expanded the ghetto where the city's Jewish population was forced to live. His rule made Florence gloomy and rigid, a far cry from the creative spirit of the Renaissance. He also became obsessed with titles and appearances. Cosimo spent years trying to get European royals to address him as His Royal Highness, desperate to be seen as the equal of kings. This obsession with rank and recognition showed how the once proud Medici had shifted their focus from building power to clinging to it. By the time Cosimo III died in 1723 at the age of 81, the Medici dynasty was running out of steam. His son Guillaume Gaston took over, but by then it was clear that the family's line was coming to an end. Guillaume Gaston had none of his ancestors' charm or vision. His marriage to Anna Maria Franziska of the powerful House of Saxe-Lauenburg had been arranged more for money than love. She was wealthy, and her dowry was meant to help revive the Medici's fading fortune, but the marriage was a disaster. The couple didn't get along, and after the wedding in 1697, they lived apart for many years. He spent much of his time in Prague, falling into depression and heavy drinking. When he finally returned to Florence and became Grand Duke in 1723, things only got worse. He rarely left his bed during the day and held strange parties at night. His wife developed an odd habit of speaking to the horses in the stables. The court became a place of sadness and odd behavior, with little of the glory that once defined the Medici name. The match had been designed to bring wealth to the Medici, but instead it symbolized the family's final decline. Where earlier Medici had married into the French royal family by offering their immense fortune, now they were marrying for money, just trying to hold on. Worse still, Guillaume Gaston and Anna Maria had no children. Without heirs, the male line of the Medici family was coming to an end. By this point, even Florence's involvement in European politics had faded. When the War of the Spanish Succession broke out in 1701, Florence stayed out of it not because they were neutral, but because they simply couldn't afford to take part. The once mighty family that had financed kings, popes, and wars was now too poor to even join a fight. And then, with Guillaume Gaston's death in 1737, the end came, with no sons, brothers, or cousins left to inherit the title. The Medici centuries-long rule over Florence and Tuscany was over. The crown passed to Francis of Lorraine, a nobleman from the powerful Habsburg family. This marked the beginning of Austrian control over Tuscany and the end of one of the most famous dynasties in European history. But even with the death of their last ruling member, the wider Medici family wasn't completely gone. They still had distant relatives across Italy, like the princes of Ottahano near Naples and other noble branches in the north. And in France, King Louis XV still carried the bloodline of Marie de Medici, while their political power had vanished. The Medici name lived on, woven into the very fabric of European history. Although the senior ruling line of the Medici family ended with Guillaume Gaston's death in 1737, the legacy they left behind in Florence, Tuscany, and all of Europe was enormous. With no direct heir to continue the dynasty, the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany passed to Francis of Lorraine, a member of the powerful Habsburg family. This was not just the end of a family's rule, it was the closing chapter of a unique era. For 3 centuries, the Medici had transformed from modest bankers into popes, queens, and grand dukes. Their fall wasn't due to assassination, war, or revolution. It was caused by something far simpler: biology. The family line had simply run out of heirs. Despite their fall from power, the Medici bloodline survived in other ways. Marie de Medici's descendants ruled France all the way to the French Revolution. Through her daughter, Henrietta Maria, the Medici family also became linked to the British royal family. Henrietta married King Charles I of England, Scotland, and Ireland in 1625. So even though the Medici no longer ruled Tuscany, their bloodline had spread across Europe's most powerful thrones. Some branches of the family survived in smaller Italian towns. The princes of Ottahano, near Naples, are from a junior line of the Medici family and still carry the name today. Another distant branch, living near Verona, holds the title of Counts of Caprara and Gavardo. These were reminders that while the Medici were no longer rulers, they hadn't completely vanished from history. Under Habsburg rule, Tuscany remained stable for a while, but like the rest of Italy, the region was slowly pulled into the growing movement toward Italian unification. After the Second War of Italian Independence in 1859, the people of Tuscany voted to join the Kingdom of Sardinia, which later became the Kingdom of Italy in 1861. Florence, once the beating heart of Medici power, was now part of a unified nation. The days of city-states and noble families ruling over them were over. Yet the Medici name still lives on in Florence. Walk through the city today and you see their legacy everywhere. The massive cathedral's Santa Maria del Fiore was a civic project, but it was shaped by Medici influence and patronage. The magnificent dome, designed by Brunelleschi, was completed thanks to the political backing of Giovanni de' Medici and others. One of the clearest examples of the Medici legacy is the Uffizi Gallery, originally built by Cosimo I in the 1500s to house government offices. It later became one of the world's most famous art museums. Today it holds works by Botticelli, Michelangelo, Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci, and countless others, many of whom were supported, encouraged, or funded by the Medici. These masterpieces stand as eternal reminders of what the family gave to the world: beauty, innovation, and a new vision of humanity through art and science. It's remarkable to think how the Medici journey began. From a small village north of Florence, they rose to become the wealthiest bankers in Europe. Cosimo de' Medici turned their fortune into political power, shaping the Renaissance through his support of artists and scholars. His grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, carried that vision even further, becoming one of the most admired leaders of his age. Then came the 16th century, when the Medici climbed even higher. They no longer just shaped cities, they shaped nations. They produced 4 popes, queens of France, and grand dukes, who ruled with near absolute authority. It was the most politically powerful period in their history. But by then, the passion that had fueled their rise had started to cool. Power became tradition. Wealth turned into ceremony. And when the bloodline ran dry, no one was left with the brilliance or energy to carry the torch. Still, history remembers them. Cosimo and Lorenzo will always be seen as giants of the Renaissance. Without them, we may never have had the explosion of art, thought, and science that reshaped Europe. The Medici were not saints. They could be ruthless, manipulative, and greedy. But they were also visionaries, builders, and protectors of genius. The end of their rule did not erase their impact. Florence remains one of the great cultural cities of the world because of them. The Renaissance, one of the most important periods in human history, owes much of its life to their money, their vision, and their willingness to defy tradition. So what should we make of the Medici? Were they just clever power players who used money and influence to get what they wanted? Or were they enlightened rulers who saw beyond their time and helped lift an entire civilization into a new age? The truth lies somewhere in between. They were both. Were flawed and brilliant, selfish and generous, cruel and deeply cultured. Whatever your answer, their story is unforgettable. What do you think about the Medici family? Were they enlightened rulers or power-hungry manipulators? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for joining us on this journey through history.